Tonight, the breaking news: Donald Trump guilty in the so-called hush money criminal trial. On the first count, Donald Trump is guilty. Count 2, guilty. Count 34, guilty. Guilty on all counts.
This is the conclusion of a trial, but it's only the beginning of a fight.
The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
The CBS Evening News starts now. A historic day in America. A former president of the United States, now a convicted felon. Good evening, I'm Norah O'Donnell, and thank you for being with us on this important night. Donald Trump seethed as he left the Manhattan courtroom today as a convicted criminal. And then here he is arriving back at Trump Tower, waving at crowds. Today, a jury of 12 New Yorkers found him guilty 34 times over of creating false business records, including these checks with his signature tied to hush money payments made to adult film star Stormy Daniels. The jurors unanimously agreed with the prosecution that these payments were part of a scheme to conceal crimes that hid damaging information from the voting public during the 2016 presidential election. We have team coverage as we answer some of the major remaining questions. How will this affect the presidential election? Is this the only criminal trial Trump will face in the months ahead? And will Trump face prison time? CBS's Robert Costa will start us off from the courthouse. Good evening. And Robert, an extraordinary day. How did the president seem?
Good evening, Nora. This was a sober reckoning for former President Donald Trump and the nation, found guilty on all counts by a jury of his peers.
The 7 men and 5 women of the jury decided Donald Trump's fate in just over 11 hours.
This was a disgrace.
Enraging the former president, who said the real decision will come in November.
The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people.
Judge Juan Merchan announced he will sentence Trump on July 11th, 4 days before the Republican National Convention. He faces up to 4 years in prison, but could be given probation with no jail time. As the verdict was read, Trump sat expressionless in the courtroom.
The jury spoke decisively. It spoke unanimously. There wasn't really any doubt at the way that they were coming out in this case. It was faster, I think, certainly than I, and I think a lot of other people who have been following this trial very closely would have anticipated, just given the length of the trial, the number of witnesses, the complexity of the issues, the fact they had 34 counts to resolve. That was unusual.
Trump was found guilty of 34 counts of falsifying records to cover up his alleged sexual encounter with Stormy Daniels during his presidential run in 2016. The jury, perhaps swayed by the prosecution's key witness, former Trump attorney Michael Cohen, who offered crucial testimony that directly implicated Trump in falsifying the $130,000 payment. Daniels herself testified in graphic detail in the trial. As they began their deliberations Wednesday, jurors asked to rehear key pieces of testimony, specifically about the 2015 Trump Tower meeting with Trump, former National Enquirer publisher David Pecker, and Cohen. Cohen testified that is where the 3 men hatched the so-called catch-and-kill scheme to spike stories that could harm Trump's 2016 presidential run. Pecker was asked by prosecutors if the purpose of the deal was to benefit the campaign. That is right, Pecker testified in April. The defense tried to portray Cohen as untrustworthy, Trump's lead attorney calling him the MVP of liars in closing arguments. Tonight, District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who brought the case against Trump, responded.
While this defendant may be unlike any other in American history, we arrived at this trial and ultimately today at this verdict in the same manner as every other case that comes through the courtroom doors, by following the facts and the law, and doing so without fear or favor.
And Robert Costa is back with us. And Robert, I know you've been talking to sources close to the former president. What do they tell you about his mood and what's next?
Sources close to former President Trump tell me tonight that he is furious and that this campaign will now become a summer of grievance. He will rail against this case and the prosecution as he tries to keep Republicans rallying around him ahead of the Republican National Convention. On the legal front, the appeals process already beginning.
Robert Costa, thank you very much. And the consequences of this verdict cannot be overstated. This goes far beyond the 2024 presidential election, but will be discussed and debated for years to come. I'm joined now by the best political and legal team in the business. Major Garrett is our CBS chief Washington correspondent, Jan Crawford, our chief legal correspondent. But let's start with Caroline Polisi, criminal defense attorney. Caroline, first, does the defense have grounds for appeal?
Absolutely, Nora. There are a lot of meritorious issues here, not the least of which is really the law, the statute on which the district attorney brought this case. Remember, we have talked for weeks now about the unique nature of what they had to prove in that this was a misdemeanor offense that they bumped up to a felony with another misdemeanor, the conspiracy to violate state election laws, and the unlawful means through which that conspiracy was achieved. The state did not have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, nor did the jury need to be unanimous with respect to what they thought the unlawful means were. To be clear, they were unanimous with respect to every element of the charged offense here, but I think you will see some due process issues being raised on appeal.
And Caroline, Donald Trump is a 77-year-old first-time offender in the eyes of the New York court system. Judge Merchan has a great deal of discretion. Do you think he'll sentence Donald Trump to prison?
I do not, Nora. For better or for worse, he is being treated not above the law, just as any other New Yorker would be in this situation. The fact is, the vast majority of defendants that are sentenced under this statute do not serve prison time. It is on the table up to 4 years. However, I do not see Judge Merchan imposing prison sentence in this instance because he is a first-time offender. It's a nonviolent offense. And the fact is that most defendants in his position would not be sentenced to prison time.
And Caroline, we do know that a convicted felon can become president of the United States, but how could probation complicate his campaigning?
It could complicate things quite a bit. If he is placed on, specific probation, he will have to sign off with his probation officer on his travel plans. And that likely is not something that the former president is used to. But again, just as I said, he will have to partake in this system just as any other criminal defendant would.
Caroline Polisi, thank you for your expertise. Let's now bring in Major and Jan. Major, this was a legal issue today, but we can't underestimate the political repercussions.
Words really fail us, Nora. There's nothing you can say or Jan can say or I can say that can adequately capture the gravity of this moment. This is terrain the country has never before seen. And it's going to create for the 2024 campaign a question never before asked. Why are we here? Former President Trump will say, we are here because there is a system arrayed against one person in America and one person only, me. And he will use that grievance to say to a wide swath of this country, if not for this system, he calls it the deep state, or some Democrats or enemies, or sometimes vermin, I would never be in this position. Another part of that question will be, wait a minute, doesn't your conduct have something to do with this? Doesn't your conduct, former President Trump, have something to do with why we are going through all of these stomach-turning legal problems, whether it's January 6th, classified documents, a conspiracy to hide information, buy and sell stories favorable to you in 2016? Isn't it your conduct that is central to why we are going through all these shockwaves to our institutions? That is going to be a question asked and answered in a way we've never had in a presidential campaign before.
But Donald Trump said this will ultimately be decided at the ballot box.
Precisely. The country will decide, will render a verdict politically on that central question. Why are we here?
And Jan Crawford, we don't know yet whether this is the only criminal trial that Donald Trump will face this year. It's likely it could be, but there are some issues before the Supreme Court, and we could get a decision in June. Tell us about that.
Well, those are two of the cases before the court now involving former President Trump, and they go to whether or not and how he can be prosecuted for his actions around January 6th and his efforts to allegedly obstruct the 2020 election. Of course, special counsel Jack Smith has charged former President Trump and is seeking to prosecute him and has asked the Supreme Court for a decision in that case in June so he can try it potentially before the election. The issue is whether Trump is immune from prosecution. I don't think, based on the arguments, the Supreme Court will say he is, but I do think this verdict today and this conviction lessens the pressure on the Supreme Court in those cases because there is a compressed timeline. Everyone wanted the court to hurry up and decide, get this decision out so Trump can be prosecuted before the election. Jack Smith can prosecute Trump anytime in December when he's in jail, if he were to go to jail, for example. So now that the opponents of President Trump and Democrats have gotten a conviction that they wanted, this will alleviate, I think, some of the pressure on the Supreme Court to, turn this quickly. But I think that decision will still come by the end of June. Whether we have a trial in that case before November, I think that was probably unlikely in any event, but it's less significant with this conviction now.
Supreme Court in June, the sentencing July 11th, the Republican convention July 15th, the Democrats' convention in August. It will be quite a summer.
Oh, by the way, Nora, the president's son on trial starting Monday.
The
president's son on trial starting Monday, a former president convicted on the Thursday before. We are in brand new space, America.
We will be watching. Thanks to both of you. We're hearing reaction tonight from President Biden's campaign, a statement coming out minutes after the verdict. Let's go to the White House and CBS's Ed O'Keefe. Good evening, Ed.
Good evening, Nora. The president will not be seen tonight in any way to react to the verdict. The only official comment from the White House came from the counsel's office saying, quote, "We respect the rule of law and have no additional comment." In a written statement, the Biden re-election campaign said in New York today, "We saw that no one is above the law. Donald Trump has always mistakenly believed he would never face consequences for breaking the law for his own personal gain." And it reminded Americans that convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. Biden remains in Delaware tonight with his extended family, having spent the day privately marking the 9th anniversary of his son Beau's death. Campaign and White House aides have said the president's reaction to the verdict is expected to be modest, understanding that for most Americans, opinions on Trump are already made, and the verdict isn't expected to sway a large number of voters in battleground states. To that end, a recent CBS News poll found the majority of Americans believe Trump is definitely or probably guilty of the charges he faced in New York. And yet, CBS News polling continues to show a tight contest between the current and former president in key battleground states. Just minutes after the verdict, the Biden and Trump campaigns sent fundraising appeals to supporters with less than a month until their first scheduled debate, as you mentioned. Trump told his supporters, quote, "I'm a political prisoner." While the president said to his, quote, "There's only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box." Nora?
Ed O'Keefe at the White House, thank you. And speaking of the ballot box, the election is now just 6 months away where American voters get to have their voices heard. So how will the historic conviction of Donald Trump factor into their decision? CBS' Nicole Killian joins us tonight from the campaign trail in battleground Pennsylvania. Good evening, Nicole. I know you've been talking to voters.
Yeah, good evening to you, Nora. And reaction from voters here in critical battleground Pennsylvania was mostly along party lines. Many Democratic voters I spoke to say they believe the former president should have been convicted, while some Republican voters I spoke to believe that this was mostly fueled by politics, although one GOP voter I spoke to said he may weigh his options when it comes to the former president.
I think that there are a lot of people out there that believe that this particular case was brought for purely political reasons, not legal reasons. He has to see whether or not it's going to uphold on appeal.
There's a lot of things that he has done wrong, and I know maybe he has a lot of followers on that. They don't believe in that, but in the past, presidents have been impeached for a lot less.
At this point, neither voter feels that this verdict will dramatically alter the trajectory of this race. Keep in mind that President Biden was just in Philadelphia yesterday. He won the state of Pennsylvania back in 2020, including here in Allentown, which is the third largest city in the state and part of a critical bellwether region. The former president was also here for a campaign rally just before his trial got underway and is set to open a campaign office here in the state next week. Nora?
All right, Nicole Killian speaking with voters tonight. Thank you very much, Nicole. And we've got the rest of the day's big headlines. That's next. Now to some breaking news out of Idaho with a guilty verdict in the case that gripped the nation, the so-called Doomsday Murders. This afternoon, Chad Daybell was convicted in the murder of his first wife and his then girlfriend's youngest children. CBS's Carter Evans reports on this disturbing case.
guilty, guilty, guilty.
As guilty verdicts were read 8 times, Chad Daybell stood expressionless while outside court. The jury took about 5 hours to convict him in the deaths of his first wife, Tammy, and 2 of his current wife's children. Their mother, Lori Vallow, found guilty in their deaths last year. Prosecutors say Daybell had created a doomsday cult, he and Lori referring to her children as zombies possessed by evil spirits. In 2018, when both were married, Chad and Lori had an affair. Within months, Vallow's husband was shot and killed, and Daybell's wife suddenly died. 2 weeks after her death, Chad and Lori married. Around the same time, her 2 youngest children, 16-year-old Tylee and 7-year-old JJ, went missing. Their bodies were found 9 months later, buried in Chad Daybell's yard. Tammy Daybell's death, originally thought to be from natural causes, was later ruled a homicide. Daybell's defense argued his DNA was not found on any of the victims, but the jury believed the prosecution.
3 dead bodies on the defendant, Chad Daybell's property. And for what? Money, power, and sex.
Well, his sentencing hearing begins tomorrow. Now the same jury must decide if Chad Daybell should face the death penalty. Nora.
Carter Evans, thank you very much. Israel gains control of an area along the border in Gaza as the war enters a new phase. That's next. The Israel-Hamas war has entered a dangerous new phase, with Israel now controlling the entire land border of the Gaza Strip, including a buffer zone between Gaza and Egypt. Israel says it found inside that zone 20 tunnels used by Hamas to smuggle weapons. CBS' Imtiaz Tayeb reports tonight from East Jerusalem.
This is as close as the CBS News team in Gaza could get to the Philadelphia corridor. Israel's military has said it's now in control of the strategically important buffer zone. 330 feet wide in parts, it runs along the Palestinian territory side of the 8-mile border with Egypt. Gaza's only other land border is with Israel itself. The Israeli military has said its operation there has already uncovered several Hamas tunnels as it pushes further into Rafah, despite intense international pressure not to. The head of the U.S. Agency for International Development warns of imminent famine in Gaza, saying conditions there are worse than ever before. Over the past few weeks, over 1 million Palestinians have been displaced from Rafah.
We can pretty much always hear sounds of war in the background.
Ryan Kerr is an American paramedic and trauma nurse from Albuquerque, New Mexico. We reached him in nearby Al-Mawasi.
Everyone is focused on finding a safe place to go.
Kerr was supposed to leave Gaza 2 weeks ago and is now stuck because of the fighting.
If you could speak to President Biden, what would you say to him?
It would just be to ask him to do what he can to make this stop.
You just want the war to end?
Yeah, I think deciding that killing people to solve a problem is probably the worst way to go about it.
And the Egyptian media are reporting its leaders are reacting with fury tonight to the Israeli military seizure of the Philadelphia corridor, saying Israel has only done so to justify its military operation in Rafah, Nora, insisting Egypt's army already destroyed all cross-border tunnels from Gaza years ago.
All right, Imtiaz Tayeb, thank you. We'll have more on the verdict of former President Donald Trump next. We end tonight where we started this broadcast, with the first former president in American history convicted in a criminal case. For the first time in this country's nearly 250-year existence, a former occupant of the Oval Office is now a convicted felon. Donald John Trump, the 45th president, convicted unanimously by a jury of his peers in New York on 34 criminal counts. This is truly uncharted territory for this country. Not only a former president, but the presumptive presidential nominee for a major party in the upcoming election. This election, like many, will be decided by a handful of battleground states. Look at this. These are the headlines in the biggest cities in Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And there's much more reaction to come in the days, weeks, and months ahead. But undeniably, this is a day that will be written into the history books. And that is tonight's CBS Evening News. I'm Nora O'Donnell. Good night.